You wake up in Russia, but to drive to Moscow you would cross two other countries first. Not one, two. An entire day's journey spent leaving your own nation before you have even left it. Pine trees outside your window. Gray Baltic Sea past the pines. This is not a border glitch. This is Kaliningrad, the only Russian territory on Earth completely sealed off from Russia by land, built inside a city that spent 7 centuries as Germany's proudest university town. How does a nation own soil it cannot walk to? Stick with this, because the real answer has almost nothing to do with war. It has everything to do with ice. Rewind to 1255. German Crusader knights called the Teutonic Order built a fortress on this coastline and named it Königsberg, King's Mountain. Why does a medieval crusade matter to a story about modern Russia? Because for the next 700 years, this city stayed proudly German, a Baltic trading port so respected that the philosopher Immanuel Kant was born there in 1724 and never once needed to leave it to reshape the way the world thinks. Amber washed up on its shores for centuries, traded along routes that reached ancient Rome, making this coastline valuable long before any nation alive today existed to fight over it. Then came 1945, and the Red Army reduced Königsberg's medieval core to rubble, street by street. What happened next, at a peace conference outside Berlin, is the entire reason your passport in this story says Russian Federation today. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Stalin asked the Western Allies for one specific piece of this coastline. Not for revenge, not for glory. So what was he actually after? The harbor here never freezes. Most of Russia's northern ports lock under ice for months every winter, and a navy without year-round access to open water is a navy stranded half the year at the dock. Exhausted and eager to close the conference, the Allies agreed, but attached one condition. This transfer was provisional, they wrote, pending a final peace treaty still to come. Care to guess how long that treaty actually took to arrive? 45 years. Land that was only ever meant to be borrowed became permanent simply because nobody with the power to reverse it ever did. So much for ancient destiny. Russia's claim to this coastline is barely 80 years old, younger than most living grandparents, and it survives today for the exact same reason Stalin wanted it in the first place. Not heritage, not shared blood, an ice-free harbor NATO cannot ignore, and Russia refuses to give up. While the paperwork sat unfinished, ordinary lives were being unmade on the ground. Families who had lived along this coast for generations were given days, sometimes only hours, to pack what fit in a suitcase before freight trains took them west for good. No court hearing, no appeal, just a ticket and a deadline. That was the reality for the German residents who remained, deported over the following years, while their homes were handed to people who did not speak a word of German. In 1946, the city itself was renamed, and here the story turns almost comedic in its carelessness. Who did they name it after? Mikhail Kalinin, a Soviet official who had died the previous month and, by most accounts, never once set foot in the place. He had, however, visited a different Soviet town also named Kaliningrad, just outside Moscow, fairly often. The mix-up between the two cities lasted exactly 50 years, until 1996, when officials finally solved it the simplest way they could think of. They swapped the two cities' names. New residents arrived from across the Soviet Union into a city still wearing German street signs and German cemeteries. For the next 4 decades, the entire region was sealed off as a restricted military zone, home to the Baltic Fleet, closed even to ordinary Soviet citizens without special permission, let alone foreigners. What was daily life like inside a zone like that? Children grew up here, rarely meeting anyone from outside the Soviet Union at all, in a city whose entire economy revolved around a fleet most of them were forbidden from even photographing. None of the underlying strangeness mattered much, though, because the republics separating this coastline from Moscow were just other rooms inside the same Soviet house. You could drive home without ever crossing a real border. Then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved overnight. Those republics became fully independent countries within days, and Russia woke up to find one of its own regions stranded behind foreign passport control on every side. That isolation created new headaches almost immediately. As Poland and Lithuania moved toward joining the European Union, they tightened their border controls, and ordinary Kaliningrad residents suddenly faced visa requirements just to visit relatives on the mainland. Russian negotiators actually floated sealing train carriages shut, curtains drawn, so passengers could cross Lithuanian soil without technically touching it. Lithuanian officials balked, worried this amounted to carving out a stretch of foreign territory running straight through their own country. Understandably, nobody wants a foreign hallway cut through their living room. So what did the two sides settle on instead? Something far less cinematic. Starting in 2002, a simplified transit permit, cheap and quick to obtain, lets Kaliningrad residents ride an ordinary train through Lithuania like anyone else, just with an extra card in their pocket. Why does any of this still matter today? Because that geography never stopped being watched. Squeezed between Poland and Lithuania sits a strip of farmland roughly 65 kilometers wide, connecting Russia's ally Belarus to this exclave, a corridor NATO planners call the Suwalki Gap. Cut that strip, and the Baltic states lose their only land route to Allied reinforcement. Former U.S. Army Europe commander Ben Hodges has said publicly that this stretch of ordinary wheat fields keeps him up at night, though a few security analysts argue the danger gets more airtime than it deserves. Either way, the stakes only grew heavier once Finland joined NATO in 2023 and Sweden followed in 2024, turning the Baltic Sea into a body of water almost entirely ringed by the alliance, with this coastline as one of Russia's last footholds on it. This patch of land is roughly the size of Connecticut, yet it now holds some of the most advanced weaponry in the Russian arsenal, including missile systems capable of reaching NATO capitals, all defending one thing above everything else: a port that simply never freezes. Kant once wrote his most famous essay from a quiet study in this same city, a blueprint for ending war forever, titled Perpetual Peace. He would not recognize the missile batteries now guarding his hometown in its name. Even trade has picked at this arrangement's seams. In 2022, Lithuania restricted certain EU-sanctioned goods, steel and iron among them, from crossing its rail lines toward Kaliningrad, and Russia answered with military drills and blunt threats. For a few tense weeks, the whole continent relearned a question this coastline has never really solved. What happens when your only road home runs through a country that owes you nothing? Cut off from cheap travel to the rest of Europe, Kaliningrad has rebranded itself for domestic Russian tourists, a walkable slice of old Europe reachable without a foreign visa. Visitors browse amber jewelry stalls and photograph restored Gothic facades in a city center that could pass for a small town in Germany or Poland, if you did not already know better. Call it Russia's Europe. No visa, no euro, and a noticeably shorter security line. If you grew up here, your city carries two histories stacked directly on top of each other: Gothic cathedral ruins beside Soviet apartment blocks, a philosopher's tomb visited by school children who do not speak his language. You are, at once, the newest people ever to call this place home, and nearly the only people left who actually live inside it full-time. None of this was ever a grand plan. It was one short-term decision stacked on another. A wartime deal explicitly marked temporary. A name picked in a hurry for the wrong city's most frequent visitor. A legal status only finalized in 1990, tucked into Germany's own reunification treaty and negotiated in part by American diplomat James Baker, agreed to almost as a footnote to a much bigger deal happening elsewhere. Some legal scholars still debate whether that status was ever as airtight as Moscow insists it is, though no government has formally challenged it since. Stack enough improvisation on top of one valuable harbor, and 80 years later, you get a fragment of Russia that Germans once called home, that a philosopher once wandered freely, and that an entire military alliance now watches more closely than almost anywhere else on the continent. Nobody sat down in 1945 and planned any of that. They just never got around to undoing it. So return to that apartment on the coast. Pine trees outside the window. Gray sea past the pines. You wake up, and your passport still says Russian Federation. To reach the rest of your own country, you still cross two borders first, exactly as you always have. What changed is not the geography. What changed is how closely the rest of the world now watches the gap between you and home.